Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Anora Wang. Today's topic is what's in the black box, knowns and unknowns about pricing algorithm from the latest academic research. Increasingly, more firms have in-house data science teams that leverage AI technologies to optimize prices and make some other maybe strategic business decisions. There are also third-party providers of AI-powered pricing algorithms for different applications. But is that a black box where competition issues may reside? So we are very interested in learning a bit about algorithm pricing. Why is it used? And maybe are there hypotheses that there may be competition issues? Joining me today is my co-host Panos Dimitrellos. Hi, Panos.
Hi, Anora.
Who is our guest today?
So our guest today, Dr. Deng, is a principal in the consulting firm Charles River Associates in the competition practice, and has advised clients in some of the largest cartel and market manipulation cases in the past decade. In addition, has written extensively on the implication of machine learning and artificial intelligence on competition. And I shouldn't forget that he's a two-time winner of the Antitrust Writing Award with his articles on the topic of algorithmic competition. So I holds a PhD in economics from Boston University, where he specialized in econometrics. As an economist, has worked closely with the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission on issues such as financial market manipulation, merger investigation, and others. I's research on algorithmic pricing has generated great interest, not just among scholars, but also policymakers, case handlers, and the general public. A has testified at the FTC's public hearing in 2018 on competition and consumer protection of the 21st century on the topic of algorithmic collusion. And he was invited to speak on this topic by the Canadian Competition Bureau. His work was quoted in the most recent antitrust guidelines issued by the Peruvian Antitrust Agency. We're very lucky to get his insights on algorithmic pricing and the latest developments in this area.
Wow, that's great credentials. Great. Without further ado, welcome to the program.
Hi, Anora. Hi, Panos. Thanks so much for the kind introduction. I'm a big fan of the show. Really excited to be here today.
So, let me start with the very basics. So, I will start with the question: how do we define collusion in the world of AI algorithms, and why is it meaningful? In other words, can AI minds meet?
Well, that's a great first question. When we think of collusion among humans, the concept of meeting of minds is rather intuitive. In practice, we will look for evidence of such meeting of minds. But as soon as we bring in artificial intelligence, pricing algorithms into the picture, then the idea of meeting minds all of a sudden becomes less obvious or less clear. As you mentioned, does AI even have a mind to speak of? Now, I would note that there is some emerging research about AI's consciousness and their intention, but that's a topic for another day. Now, if meeting of minds is no longer well defined when we deal with artificial intelligence, then how do we define collusion? And we all know that it's important to have a working definition in our business. Well, to do that, as economists, we will just go back and look at how collusion actually works. Now, most of us in the antitrust community are familiar with the classic prisoner's dilemma. There, the prisoners understand if they collude, right? If they both refuse to confess, they'd be better off. But the interdependence of their actions would lead both of them to confess. Now, this is exactly the same challenge that any cartel faces. If I know that you're going to raise your price, something that we may have previously agreed to, then I will naturally have the incentive to set my price maybe just a little bit lower than yours and make more sales and generate more revenue for myself. And of course, you are going to have exactly the same incentive. So this incentive is something that any cartel must address if they want to sustain their exclusive agreement. Now, if we assume firms care about their current and future profit, then one way to sustain an agreement will be to devise and implement a so-called reward and punishment scheme. The way it works is we would all agree to cooperate. We would agree to set a higher price, allocate customers, if we all stick to our agreement. If not, we're going to punish cheater by, say, starting a price war. Of course, the price war will affect all of us, but that's the price you have to pay to make it work. And of course, the hope is that the threat and the commitment to punish will be sufficient to prevent cheating from happening in the first place. So what's the key takeaway here? Well, the key takeaway here is that a cartel agreement typically needs to rely on such a reward and punishment scheme. Now, I will make a side note, an important side note that I think it's often underappreciated in my view, and that is the use of artificial intelligence by itself does not magically eliminate the incentive problem that I just described. Now, back to the definition. One definition of collusion that applies to both humans and AIs can be based on the presence of a reward and punishment scheme. Professor Joe Harrington first articulated this definition, this point, I should say, in the context of pricing algorithms, and it has been widely adopted ever since.
But how is a reward punishment scheme different from rational profit maximizing behavior?
Yeah, I would say that the reason why such a reward and punishment scheme works is precisely because of the rational profit maximizing behavior. Rewards leads to higher profit, punishment leads to less. Of course, the words reward and punishment do not have to refer to monetary gains necessarily. The idea is really that of carrot and stick, if you will.
So just to clarify, so from an economist perspective, does the reward and punishment scheme definition works the same or even better in identifying collusion than the definition of meeting of minds?
Yeah, I would say that for economists, this idea of reward and punishment is the definition, is sort of how we characterize or how cartel works. So I would say it's sort of it's basically a different way to say the same thing. I think meeting of minds is more of a common sense term, but at its core, rewards and punishment is a defining characteristic of how cartel works.
Back to the AI learning scheme, how should we imagine AI's approach to economic incentives?
Right. I think at the fundamental level, AI approaches economic incentives the same way we as humans do. Both AIs and artificial intelligence, we as humans are motivated by the desire to maximize rewards and minimize costs. Today, AI developers will specify for their algorithms the objectives they should work to get at. We as economists call them objective functions. Most of what today's AI does is to optimize or maximize that objective function. And of course, AI do things differently. AI can process a large amount of data, information much faster than we can. They can learn much faster and better. One could also argue that AI is not biased, although we have a debate over that. AI can never be emotional, and so on. So AI do things differently from we do, but at its core, so the fundamental motivation is the same.
So, going over the literature, one can see two broad categories of algorithmic collusion being mentioned. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure. Broadly speaking, we can define two types of algorithmic collusion. The first type is essentially the use of AI algorithms to implement a human cartel agreement. Another type would be autonomous algorithmic tacit collusion. The idea being that artificial intelligence figuring out how to collude on their own without being instructed to do so and without any communications. Now, I'd say that the first type is probably not new, despite the involvement of smart technologies like AI, because at the end of the day, the technologies such as artificial intelligence are used simply as a tool. So in that sense, they're perhaps not fundamentally different, from emails replacing letters and phone calls replacing the need to travel. And I would know that obviously this is not the only way to categorize algorithmic collusion, but these two types cover a lot of interesting cases.
Right. So about the first category, have we ever seen humans using algorithms to implement a collusion?
Yeah, the most famous case is probably the Tompkins case that the U.S. Department of Justice pursued in 2015. And that's when the DOJ uncovered a conspiracy among some Amazon sellers of posters. It was reported that the defendants in that case used a certain pricing algorithm to coordinate their pricing. Around the same time, the UK's CMA also charged another firm for a similar conspiracy, again, among online sellers. Again, the defendants were apparently were using a pricing algorithm to implement their agreement. Another case, there was a mention of another case about auto spare parts involving the use of pricing algorithm to fix the spare parts prices in France. It was reported that the French Antitrust Authority had looked into that case, but found insufficient evidence. But details are very sparse on that case in the public domain. So the answer is yes. There have been instances and at least allegations of using AI technologies to implement their cartel agreement.
That's really interesting. And I want to go to the second category now. So should we imagine algorithms or AI learning to collude by itself in the second category, or is more having humans coding it to being able to collude?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always think that is the $1 million question of all these. Now, based on the latest academic research that I've seen, the answer is yes. At least in yes, you can design an algorithm to collude, at least in an experimental environment. Recent studies in economics, AI, and even operational research have started to present both theoretical and experimental evidence that an algorithm can be designed to collude. I want to give you one simple example, something that I find to be very instructive as well. And this is a pricing algorithm that consists of two modules, a collusive module and a competitive module. Now, you may wonder, why do we need two modules to make it work? Well, the intuition is that in a competitive environment, barring any explicit human collusion and communication, you really don't know what your competitors may do, what their intentions are. So if your algorithm simply instructs you to raise prices to a supra competitive level, your competitors may simply take advantage of that by keeping the price low and making a lot of sales. Of course, at the same time, maybe your competitor would follow your lead and engage in some sort of tacit collusion with you. So basically, your algorithm needs to be smart. Smart in the sense that it can, tacitly collude when your competitors are willing to do so, but it can also compete and avoid being exploited, so to speak, when your competitors are not willing to follow along. Now, the researchers of that study were able to develop such an algorithm, but again, to be precise, in an experimental setting using computer simulations. We're not talking about real prices or real products yet. Now, the key point here, I want to go back to Panos, the point that you just made. The latest research strongly suggests that if you want to develop a collusive algorithm, the collusive features, right? The features that will facilitate collusion needs to be built in, right? They need to be part of the design process. And as long as you do that, it's totally possible. Now, I think the significance of this insight is that once the collusive features become part of the design, they are in theory discoverable, exposed. In other words, there should be a paper trail, if you will.
And going back to evidence of algorithmic tacit collusion, a very influential study that comes to my mind is Calvano's 2020 paper, which is seen as, quote, the most convincing evidence of algorithmic tacit collusion by single-minded profit maximizing algorithms with no communication or instruction. I will really like to hear what is your take about the most fascinating finding of this paper.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, Calvano et al. 2020 was a highly influential study, largely because it was the first paper that appeared to have provided the most convincing evidence of algorithmic tacit collusion using a pricing algorithm that is, number one, not designed to collude. So unlike the algorithm that I just described. Number two, was designed to simply maximize profits by interacting with competitors and learning from the data. In other words, the pricing algorithm that they developed appears to be completely innocent. And yet the researchers showed that their algorithm appeared to have learned this reward and punishment strategy to reach and sustain supra-competitive prices. Now, in a really fascinating experiment, the researchers forced one of the algorithms, or I should say the algorithm used by one of the competitors, to lower its price from the supra-competitive level, right? So that's sort of like a deviation from a tacit collusive prices. Now, interestingly, right after the competitor's algorithm lowers its own price by even a greater amount. Okay, and then both algorithms starts to gradually raise their prices and eventually back to the original supra-competitive level. So this is really interesting because this exactly mirrors a reward and punishment scheme. I would argue that this finding is really the one piece of evidence that has led the researchers to conclude that their algorithm has indeed successfully learned to collude. Now, many in the antitrust policy domain have also taken note of this study for very good reason, right? For example, it does appear that current antitrust laws do not apply to such an innocent pricing algorithm, even if it learns to tacitly collude and charges supra-competitive prices. Again, to be very clear, this study was still an experimental study in sort of a computer simulated environment. Again, we're not talking about real prices with real products.
It's very funny to hear that even innocent algorithms can get corrupted by economic forces. Were there any follow-ups to Calvano's findings?
Yeah, this area is truly dynamic and active, and which is one reason why this is so interesting. So more recent research has basically started challenging some of their core findings and conclusions. In fact, I remember not long after the working paper version of this came out, I wrote a short article for Law 360 to discuss several practical limitations of their algorithm. A theoretical study that came out, I think, 2 years ago, by now formalized many of the limitations that I discussed in my article. But here, let me mention one particular finding, which is super interesting here. So two researchers, they took the Calvano et al. Algorithm and did a very interesting experiment. Now, instead of forcing one of the competitors to deviate, right, to lower price, right, to cheat, they instead forced one of the competitors to raise their prices even further. And this is after they observed that the supra-competitive price set by the algorithms is still well below the monopoly price level, right? So that means there is still room to grow. So the idea is a really powerful one, right? Because the idea is that if the algorithm had indeed successfully learned to collude, then raising prices further should be seen as perhaps an invitation to go further, right? To generate more revenue, to generate more profit for both competitors. Now, what's really interesting here is that the researchers of the study found that the competitor's algorithm still started a price war by lowering its prices significantly. So, given this evidence, it's no longer clear that you can claim that the algorithm has indeed learned to collude. Now, other researchers have put out additional analyses and reached similar conclusions for other reasons. So to me, these more recent findings collectively, cast some serious doubt on the original claim of the discovery of a self-learning autonomous collusive algorithm.
Thanks, I think algorithm and AI are apparently on the top of policymakers' mind, right? It may have even appeared in the still in draft format of the merger guidelines at the time of our recording. For instance, the draft merger guidelines seems to connect market transparency with the possibility of collusion. So does the use of pricing algorithms always facilitate tacit collusion? I think that's sort of like the fundamental question that we need to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. The role of transparency is quite interesting and quite complex as well. I think in the context of artificial intelligence, transparency is taking a center stage for a very good reason, because we think that AI is at least capable of significantly improving transparency. I think it's certainly correct to look at transparency and ask the question, whether it makes collusion easier. But it's certainly not correct to assume that transparency will always facilitate collusion. I would say economic research in the past 7-8 years, in particular, has shown that transparency could basically be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, transparency could make monitoring cartel members' behavior easier. The idea is that you can't punish anyone if you don't even observe what they do. Transparency could also make it easier for cartel members to adapt their strategy, their pricing, to generate more benefits from their agreement. But the more recent insight is that transparency can also undermine collusion. Of course,
I think that bit is very interesting. I'd like to hear your elaboration on that.
Happy to provide more and give you. Well, I also want to give you 2 examples to sort of show why and how such incentive may arise. Now, let me give you the bottom line intuition here, right? Beyond all the math, put all the math aside, the intuition is really that the more information and more transparency may give cartel members more incentive to cheat. Okay, remember, cheating and preventing cheating is the most important problem any cartel faces and needs to address. So again, let me give you 2 examples to demonstrate this idea. One hypothetical, one real life. All right, so let's start with a hypothetical example. Suppose you and I are, I really like this example. So suppose you and I are 2 vendors, small vendors at a park, right? We have 2 things we can sell: umbrellas and ice cream. And we can sell only one product on a given day, okay? We have a small cart. We can't pack both products. We have to make a decision. If I bring umbrella, that's everything I can sell, right? Now,
assuming it's associated with the weather and temperature.
Okay, you're getting ahead of me. So let's assume that umbrellas will sell on a rainy day and ice cream on a sunny day, right? Again, remember, we can't sell both individually.
Okay.
Here comes the most important assumption. So let's assume that neither of us have a weather forecast. So this is getting to what you're thinking about. And we have to pack our car the day before, right, without the knowledge of the weather the next day. Now, in the absence of a weather forecast, a situation that we may end up being in could be some sort of coordination. okay, whether explicit or tacit, right? And that is, we will each bring a different product to sell at the market, right? If you bring umbrellas, I will bring ice cream, or vice versa. And by doing that, we know that one of us will make monopoly profit on the day when the weather agrees with our choices, right? One of our choices, not both. Okay. So what that means is that on any given day, there will be no competition. We will not be competing because we're bringing different products here. Now imagine someone just give us a reliable weather forecast for the next day. Well, guess what? If it's going to rain, if I know it's going to rain tomorrow, I'd argue that both of us all of a sudden would have an added incentive to bring umbrellas to the market, right? And if we do, that will lead to competition. So in this hypothetical example, the additional information about weather or the transparency about the weather has the effect of potentially undermining coordination. Now, let me give a real-world example of how this works. Now, this example comes from a study of a bidding ring cartel in Japan. Now, a very common way a bidding ring works is to designate a winner of the auction even before the actual auction takes place. And it was reported that this cartel kept the bid of the winning cartel member, this designated winner, a secret from other cartel members. So why is that, right? Why would a cartel want to keep this pricing information, this winning bid, a secret? Well, the reason is likely that knowing the bid that the designated winner is going to submit to the auction and winning the auction would allow another cartel member to accurately set its own bid if they want to cheat, right, and win the auction instead. Now, not knowing the designated winning bid just makes it harder for the cheater, right? They were like, oh, even if I change or raise my bid, I'm not sure I will win. And in fact, I may be caught by cheating without winning the business. And by the way, there are other cartel cases in which it was reported that cartel members also tried to withhold information from each other. So I think the bottom line here is really a lot of these, transparency included, requires a very careful analysis and cannot be assumed to affect the economic outcome in only one direction.
I think that's fair. And just to follow up on that and maybe to pile on a little bit. So what makes our discussions today or more important is that we're not just talking about policy changes that's looking forward. We're looking at active or ongoing litigations brought alleging collusion that have happened in the past through pricing algorithms. So for people who are not familiar, there is a recent case brought in Nevada accusing hotel owners using shared pricing algorithms to set rates instead of making independent pricing and supply decisions, which resulted in artificially high hotel room rates. And then another recent case was brought against a real estate software and data analytics company, alleging that the company facilitated a rental property cartel with landlords and property managers, driving up the prices that renters can pay each month. So with the ongoing litigations, and without going into the specific allegations in those cases, we see that on a high level, there can be allegations against the firms using pricing algorithm, and even against developers of those algorithms. So, from an economic perspective, are the profit incentive of a pricing algorithm developer different from that of a firm using the pricing algorithm, I guess?
Yeah, I think the cases that you mentioned, Anora, has to do with the use of third-party pricing algorithms, to be very precise. And you're absolutely right. There's this question that we have to answer, which is whether third-party algorithm developers have the same incentives as the users of their algorithm. So now, if I just take a step back and then kind of talk about why some of us tend to think that the use of a common third-party algorithm tends to make collusion easier. So let's start there. I think the intuition that the use of third-party algorithm kind of makes collusion easier is perhaps based on the idea that those developers have to consider the possibility that their algorithms may have to compete against themselves in the marketplace. So as a result, there may be some incentive to make their algorithms less competitive, to soften competition. But going back to the point that you're making, a very important point to realize is that third-party developers can indeed have a very different profit incentive than the users of their algorithm. So, for the sake of this discussion, let's assume that developers cannot profit share. they cannot participate in profit sharing with their users, right? So let's put that aside. Instead, let's say they charge for usage, right? So if more people buying, more people are using, they're getting more revenue. Now, in that case, what a developer really wants is to have more adoption, right? Now, once we realize that, things become more interesting. A recent study by Professor Joe Harrington examined this very incentive of third-party developers. And he found that it actually would not make sense for the developers to design the algorithm to just raise prices to a super competitive level. Again, the intuition here is somewhat similar to a point that I raised just a few minutes ago. So just hypothetically say Anora, me, and Panos, let's say three of us there are the three major competitors in the market. Suppose if I'm the first one to adopt this algorithm and was told to raise prices, then what you, Anora, and Panos could do is, again, to take advantage of that, right? By keeping your prices lower than mine and generate a lot of sales for yourselves. So to put differently, if the algorithm's objective is to simply raise prices, and then me being the first one adopting this algorithm would actually make you two less willing to adopt the same algorithm for the reason I just described, because you don't want to be exploited, right? So that's exactly the opposite of what the third-party developer would want, right? They want more adoption. So this study shows that indeed, under the assumption of the model, third-party algorithms would not raise average prices or reduce competition, but instead, it will make prices more sensitive to demand variation. So, that is, if there's a positive demand shock, people all of a sudden love your product, they want to buy more for whatever reason. The algorithms will raise prices even more, generating more profit when and where demand is strong. So I think the key insight here is that the use of third-party algorithms, again, requires a very careful analysis, and clearly it does not always imply a softening of competition.
Anything else? This has been a fascinating conversation. Anything else before we go to a more personal segment? This is obviously an area to watch. Any final thoughts that you have about the studies and about AI and pricing algorithm in general?
Yeah. So how about let me maybe use the last few minutes to summarize some of the key lessons. So I would say, number one, there is no convincing evidence of self-learning, autonomously including robots yet. I want to emphasize the word yet, because the research is very active from multiple disciplines. Things can change. Number two, it is possible to design collusive algorithms as long as the collusive features, objectives are built in. In other words, design matters. How you design the algorithm really matters. A related point that I made earlier, which I think is important enough to reiterate here, and that is when you design with collusive features built in, that makes algorithmic collusion of that type discoverable, exposed. I think that's a very helpful point to keep in mind. Now, thirdly, I believe at this stage, the more significant antitrust risk is still the use of these AI tools to facilitate human collusion. In other words, I still think that humans will need to play a very critical role here. And lastly, I'd say that in the past 5 years or so, economists have uncovered many subtle ways in which algorithms can affect prices, and not all of which involve a reward and punishment scheme. I'm very excited about what future research is going to tell us to help us better understand the impact of pricing algorithms on pricing and competition, even if the effects are not necessarily a result of collusion.
Fascinating. I think that's a lot to wrap our heads around. So thank you very much for that. And now we're going to turn to a more personal segment. And first question that we always ask in this segment is to ask you to tell us something about you that people don't know if we just know you professionally. And don't tell us you are actually AI, because I can't stop just thinking about this. Your name is AI, and we're on the topic of AI. Is there a clue? Is there something? Is that a secret that you have been keeping from us?
Where life takes you, right? Yeah, no, I often give a joke like that before most of my presentations on artificial intelligence. I would say that, look, AI is everywhere. I know because I'm one of them. But back to the question, it's an interesting one. So I guess most people may not know that I'm a pretty big basketball fan. I love watching basketball. I love playing basketball. Obviously, I'm way past my prime, if I had a prime at all. But I'd be happy to pick up a basketball and trying to make some shots and doing some layups whenever I can.
Do you like a specific team?
That's a good question. And I don't think so. I mean, I follow the NBA very, very closely. I read NBA news every day. I've been living here in DC for 16 years. So yeah, I do care. I do care how Wizards are doing every year. Not the most exciting thing, yeah. but I do care.
They're not doing that great, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I can imagine many lawyers and economists wanting to learn more about AI and algorithmic pricing. But given that the field is closer to computer science, I can imagine some people being scared that they may not have the necessary background to learn more. So would you have to say anything to these people? Any advice?
Yeah, happy to. I would highly recommend starting, if you are just starting out and trying to catch up, I would highly recommend starting with my book chapter in the report on digital economy. This chapter is available on my SSRM page. I think we probably will provide a link to it as well. It's available for free. That chapter starts with an intuitive introduction to machine learning and AI, and then discusses algorithmic collusion and another very interesting topic, algorithmic compliance. Now, I wrote that chapter about three years ago. My more recent articles, again, I think we will provide some links to in the show notes, cover more recent developments, some of which we actually discussed today. One thing I set out to do myself since the beginning is to closely monitor what's going on in the literature, and through my writing, communicate those insights to the antitrust community, so you don't have to. But if you want to go to the source, definitely keep an eye on the rapidly growing literature on economics of algorithms, and of course, the literature in artificial intelligence and even operational research. Those are the areas that I personally follow very closely.
Now, this is fascinating. As listeners who are familiar with our show, we have a final segment called The Curious Hat.
And now it's time for The Curious Hat!
So the way we usually do this is we ask you to pick a number from an imaginary hat, where we have some trivial questions that we would ask you. So now, since we're on the topic of AI, I probably would pick a question that's actually not written by us, but generated by AI. But you still have to pick a number.
All right. Is there a range I should?
1 through 15.
1 through 15. All right. As an econometrician, I will pick 7.5. Oh, I know. It doesn't work. 7.
7?
Yes.
Okay. So the question we have here is that if you can meet an economist, dead or alive, for dinner, who would that be?
That's a good question. I think it would be super cool to meet and have dinner with Clive Granger. So he's a Nobel Prize winning econometrician. He passed away many years ago, but he had made a lot of fundamental contributions to the field of econometrics. which is a subject that I specialize in grad school and continue to be fascinated about, continue to do research and work in. So grandeur will be my top choice.
Do you think he would be puzzled by anything we discussed today about AI and pricing algorithms?
It's a good question. I think he will be delighted to, and in fact, there is this convergence, more and more interactions between economics, econometrics, and artificial intelligence. I think that intersection is becoming really interesting and is generating a lot of ideas that now you see a lot more interdisciplinary studies now than even 5-6 years ago. So this is a really exciting time for economists as well for that reason.
Right. With that, thank you, and thank you, Panos, and thank you for the listeners. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.